Hello YouTube. Tamriel's known history spans thousands of years, from the mythical creation of the world to the events of the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim in the 4th era. And over that time, Tamriel changed significantly and experienced several eras and phases in its history. And today I want to take a look at what Tamriel was like before both humans and elves had landed on its shores, a period of time that I like to call Prehistoric Tamriel. What did this extremely ancient Tamriel look like, who ruled it, and what creatures roamed the land? We'll talk about it all and more after the intro. So, Prehistoric Tamriel. I have covered some of the aspects of it in the past, like what peoples lived on it and what now extinct creatures roamed the land in this ancient time, so some parts of this video may be familiar to long-term viewers, but I wanted to bring it all together in one big overview video that also adds tons of new information. Like, for example, before we can truly talk about a Tamriel in prehistoric times, we first have to define what prehistoric time on Tamriel actually is. You see, in our own world, we define prehistoric basically by are there written sources about what's going on during this time period and from this area. Especially that last part is important here, as it means that some places may actually experience history, while other parts of the world may still be in prehistory times. We actually see this in human history, as not all parts of the world developed into a similar pace or developed writing at a similar phase. Now, for Tamriel, I want to take a similar yet a little bit different approach. You see, most if not all written sources that we have about the very earliest time on Tamriel are recorded by the ancient ancestors of the elves, the Aldmer with a D, who landed on Tamriel and recorded what they found when they came there. This means that in many places on Tamriel, history started when the elvish explorers of the early Meretic era came to the area. But even then, it's not that simple, as on the south of Tamriel there was the Argonian Zenmir society, which was actually quite well developed and advanced, far more advanced than the Argonians are today, and the Khajiit also had their 16 tribes and later 16 kingdoms in the south. Both created written sources, however both societies inexplicably experienced events which resulted in the loss of much of the records of these times. For one, the Argonians experienced an event called the Duskfall, in which their religious outlook on life changed from wanting to resist the change and destruction of cities by building strong stone structures like the Zenmir pyramids, to then embracing his change and living without permanent structures and without the need to properly record history, making much of the history lost to the rot of time from before the Duskfall, so at the time that they were really advanced. This all happened really long before the elves came to Tamriel, as when the first elves set foot in Blackmarsh, they already found the Zenmir pyramids ruined and ancient. Now, as for the Khajiit, they too had a thriving civilization when the elves first discovered Tamriel, and they never abandoned their way of life. Unfortunately, they too had an event which caused for much of pre-First Era Khajiiti history to be forever lost, as in the year 463 of the First Era, that's already thousands of years before the events of Skyrim, the Corinth Grand Archive, a large library recording the collective history of the Khajiit, burned down, causing for much of their history to be forever lost. By the way, I made a whole video on that event and the reasons behind it burning down. It's not very relevant for this video, but I'll put it in the description in case you want to learn more, as it's actually a really interesting event. Anyway, with the Khajiit and Argonians having the two actually developed realms, as we'll talk about in a bit, and their history being lost, there isn't a whole lot in terms of written sources from before the elves landed on Tamriel. This means that I personally see Prehistoric Tamriel as the era of time which came after the chaos of creation, so after the Dawn era, for which we know absolutely nothing for certain, so the period after the chaos of creation, to then the period when the elves landed on Tamriel, at the end of the early Meretic era or even beginning of the middle Meretic era, as we're not super sure on the exact timing. So depending on whether you count dragon breaks or not, which I will, we're talking about a period of 7 to 6,000 years before the events of Skyrim and 6 to 5,000 years before the events of the Elder Scrolls Online, which is actually quite a long time before any of our playtimes. Alright, so that having been said, what did this ancient prehistoric Tamriel look like? Well, first of all, geographically it looked much like the Tamriel that we see now, except far more empty. In a bit we'll talk about the few peoples who lived on this ancient version of the continent, But there are a few things we know about the land and the landscape as well. First of all, while the advanced empires of the time in the Khajiit and the Argonians were in the south, we know of at least 2 structures existing in northern Tamriel, which at this time was either completely empty or inhabited by goblins, centaurs and orcs, depending on which origin of the orcs you believe, as there are sources which claim that the orcs or Orsimer were one of the native races of Tamriel, as the first Altmerry explorers claim to have encountered them already on Tamriel. But that depends on whether that's propaganda or which orcish origin you believe. However, if there were orcs, they must have been tribal, just like any other intelligent races like the goblins who might have lived in northern Tamriel, as they either did not build permanent structures and buildings, or they did and time and wear has reduced them to rubble, as we don't find any prehistoric structures in the north, save for a few known structures. First of all, we know that the Adamantine Tower in High Rock on the Isle of Balfiera, and second, the Skyforge in Whiterun, are both from a prehistoric time. Now, both of these structures are said to predate the Elvish arrival to Tamriel, and seem to be leftovers from the Chaotic Dawn era that made it into the Merethic era. You see, the Dawn era, or Era of Creation, is a time that we don't know anything for certain about. Every race and culture has their own unreliable legends about this time, and none tell the true story. But an emerging trend is that we find in every creation myth, almost every creation myth, a conflict between order and chaos, or Anu and Padome, at the very start of creation. And we see that after that some spirits were born out of order and chaos, and those spirits then created the mortal world at the suggestion of one betrayer or trickster spirit, which is called Lorkhan, although he's also known as Shor, Sap, Lorkash, Shazar and many other names. When creation was nearly finished and the other spirits, which we now know as the Aedric gods, so gods like Akatosh, Mara, Dibella, they discovered the trick or betrayal of the trickster god, which in many cultures basically amounts to, in order to create the mortal world, their powers were drained, although again this is all very unreliable. Now, when they discovered this betrayal, they created the Adamantine Tower, a majestic gold-created white spire, which would later serve as a model for the white gold tower created by the Aelids millennia later. And there, at the tower, the creators of the world allegedly convened to discuss the treachery or tricks of Lorkhan, and in punishment, there did his trial and ripped out his heart, throwing it across Tamriel towards the place where we can now find Red Mountain, Tamriel's biggest volcano, which came into being where his heart landed. Now, if this all seems vague, it's because we have countless different variations of this story, none of which we have confirmed to be true. However, there's a through line throughout all of these legends, and in it is an explanation as to why the Adamantine Tower already existed when the recorded history of Tamriel first began, and that is because the gods constructed this tower to judge whether Lorkhan or Shazar or Shor, or however you want to call the trickster god, betrayed them, and then eventually they judged him and threw out his heart. So that's why we already find the Adamantine Tower there. Now, the second structure, the Skyforge, is a strange magical forge at the base of an ancient statue of a hawk. It's also said to stem from these exact ancient times, although a little bit later than the Adamantine Tower. Because while we know very little for certain about the Skyforge, a big theory is that the Skyforge is a remnant of the ancient Elnofey Wars, which was a series of conflicts between the progenitor races of elves and men, which took place in the Dawn era, just after Lorkhan's heart was ripped out. In these vague mythological wars, two groups of Elnofey, the progenitors of man or humans, and the progenitors of Mur or elf, fought a devastating magical war, which in the legends is the cause for Nirn's different continents, as before this war the world was allegedly one, yet after it the world had been forever sundered by the extreme magics of this war, and thus the continents were created as their powerful magic ripped the world apart. Now, the Skyforge seems to be a part of this conflict and has likely been built during the conflict by those Elnofey who would later evolve to be the ancestors of the first men, as when the Proto-Nords came to Tamriel from Atmora and found the Snow Elves in Skyrim, millennia later, the elves told them that the forge and the gigantic hawk statue had been there since before their arrival, and no elf dared settle next to it. Now, I have seen some theories online as to what the Skyforge was meant to be during this conflict, none of which are confirmed to be true, as this is very much an era of guesswork. We only know that it was there long before the elves' arrival. But my favorite theory by far is that the Skyforge, which by the Nords over the ages has been used as a place to burn bodies in respectful funeral pyres because the forge somehow reacts to that in some way, was maybe originally the place where Lorcan or Shore's body was cremated after his heart was ripped out, and the hawk standing above it then symbolizes the god Cain, who would have carried his body to the afterlife. This would explain why the forge produces extremely high quality metals throughout unknown magical means, as a god's body was literally burned on it. And it also explains why the forge reacts to funeral pyres, but to be honest, that's all just theory, so take it with a big grain of salt. Now, in addition to that, it's also said that some Daedric shrines and totems stem from this ancient time, indicating that the Daedric princes were of course already active in this primitive Tamriel, with whatever intelligent races and tribal peoples were actually active there. And we know that the standing stones of Tamriel, specifically those from Skyrim, and the Allmaker stones in Solstheim, also stem from this same time, but what function they serve to the ancient peoples, or whether they were even built by the ancient peoples or perhaps by the Alnofey or by the gods, we don't really know, we just know that they were there. So, while northern Tamriel was likely mostly barren with only impermanent structures built by tribal peoples who had lived there, like goblins and orcs and potential others, like centaurs, we don't know about a lot else. We do know that in the midst of the wilderness, the Adamantine Tower and the Skyforge and some desolate shrines and standing stones stood as remnants of the chaotic and mythical Dawn era, but we don't know much more. Now, what we do know is that in many places the climate was actually a lot different. Southern Skyrim, for example, was covered in big glaciers, which are the cause for much of the hills and large rocks found across Skyrim in later eras, as glaciers force the ground into hills and actually carry stones with them, which of course stay behind once the glaciers melt. Now, we also know that at some point in its history, Cyrodiil was likely a jungle. While in Daggerfall and Morrowind era lore, Cyrodiil was often depicted as jungle-like, later lore retconned this and then said that Tiber Septim used godlike powers to make it temperate, and then different pieces of the lore kept being stacked upon those theories until eventually Elder Scrolls Online gave us the theory that it was not Tiber Septim who made the jungle disappear, but most likely the Aelids who changed the climate using the mythical powers of the White Gold Tower that they constructed, making Cyrodiil less jungle-like. And then according to the latest lore, that power was then likely used again by the Riemann Empire who made it into the Cyrodiil that we know today. Either way, it seems that Cyrodiil, behind all of these retcons and attempted lore reparations, at least when the elves arrived, likely was a jungle or at least subtropical, but honestly after all the lore changes on that, I wouldn't be surprised if that changed again. Alright, now let's go southward, as on southern Tamriel we can find some bigger civilizations, and luckily for me, Past Me already recorded a whole video on that, so let's now switch to Past Me, who with some lore corrections and additions by Present Me, will talk about the civilizations on ancient Tamriel. Take it away, Past Me. In the earliest of early records about Tamriel beyond mythic times, we know that beastfolk dominated the continent, as Tamriel had two big and powerful civilizations in the south. The first was the Khajiit civilization, divided into 16 clans which would later become 16 kingdoms. This ancient civilization of Khajiit ruled not only elsewhere but also large parts of Cyrodiil and Valenwood, with these 16 kingdoms working together in harmony under the symbolic rule of the Main, the spiritual leader of all the Khajiiti people. Now, something interesting here is that the early Khajiit realm was functionally very different from what you'd expect with 16 different kingdoms. You would expect them to be competitive, trying to screw each other over all the time, and be hyper-territorial, but that's really the opposite of what ancient Khajiiti society was like. In truth, the 16 kingdoms were, at least at first, more like 16 trading posts used for the nomadic groups of the Khajiit to trade with each other, with these 16 trading posts eventually attracting more and more nomadic Khajiit to come live there, leading to city formations and eventually leading to 16 kingdoms. Now, these 16 kingdoms weren't competing against each other so much. Rather, in the legends that we have, we hear of them working together, each using their strength to help the others. Those specialized in fishing traded fish with the others, while those adept in combat provided soldiers to other kingdoms to protect themselves, and so on. According to the legends, power distribution in this period was also very interesting. While the Main was officially the spiritual leader of the Khajiiti people, the stances and phases of the moons actually determined which kingdom had the leadership position over the entire Khajiiti realm for a period of time, meaning that depending on the moon's stance, at one point the Khajiiti king or queen of the kingdom of Torval, one of the 16 kingdoms, may politically dominate the realm, while during another moon stance, the king or queen of Canarthia may dominate the realm politically. It's said to have been a large and prosperous realm, and in these ancient times, before the arrival of the elves to Tamriel, who would eventually ruin this realm, many territories in the realm were still wild and untamed, with only nomadic groups of Khajiit of the 16 clans traveling around in them. With the 16 kingdoms in this time more being like 16 influential city-states which all work together to protect a common territory. Now, at the same time of this Khajiiti domination of southern Tamriel and parts of the Heartland, southeastern Tamriel was dominated by another great power, the Argonian Zenmir society, named after the massive stone Zenmir pyramids that they built. It's during this period where the Argonians were by far the most developed and advanced civilization on all of Tamriel. They were advanced in building techniques, magic, and even developed one of Tamriel's first calendars. Now, in terms of what this society was actually like, we know that it was ruled by the so-called Niswo, a class of priests of Sithis with king-like powers who committed blood sacrifices to Sithis to appease him and ward off his chaos and destruction, which these ancient Argonians tried to resist at all cost. It's why they built the big Zenmirs, which would stand for millennia, and which later Argonians would then call their ancient stone nests. Their society had advanced magic, gigantic temples, and great craftsmanship of metal, stone, and wood, which wouldn't be seen on Tamriel again until the likes of the Dwemer. It's a stark contrast with the Argonians that we see in the Second Era, as by that point most Argonians live nomadic and simple lifestyles. Now, this change can be explained by the view of the Argonians on the entity Sithis. You see, Second Era and presumably also Third Era Argonians see Sithis as this force of change, and they see change as a positive thing, and thus they live primarily ever experiencing the change without trying to resist it. Meanwhile, the ancient Argonians of the Zenmir period saw Sithis as an evil destroyer of chaos, and thus they tried to resist him by resisting change and chaos. To resist chaos, they tried to arrange time through a calendar, they tried to control the weather through magic, and they tried to resist destruction by building massive stone pyramids and other stone structures so effectively that they would be able to resist any destruction and withstand the erosion of thousands of years of time. Something that they actually largely succeeded in, as it's said that even by the 4th era most of these pyramids still stand, and actually 4th era Argonians are using them again to some degree, which is actually endlessly fascinating, as the whole reason that they got abandoned was that the Argonians' view on Sithis suddenly changed dramatically, and once they learned to embrace change of Sithis rather than resist it, they saw it as silly to continue using these stone nests, as they called it, and they basically devolved their civilization back to a tribal lifestyle. Now, this devolving is called the Duskfall, and I have a whole video in the description of this video where I go into more detail about it. But what's interesting to know about it for this video is that when the elves arrived on Tamriel, the Zenmir pyramids were already long since abandoned, indicating that on ancient Tamriel, once Zenmir society of the Argonians suddenly fell, it were actually the Khajiit, at least for a time, with the only real structured society as far as we know. Although, there are legends of another civilization flourishing on the coasts and in the waters of northern Tamriel at this time, as the Dreg as the game pronounce it, or Droog as you write it, according to the Daggerfall user guide, were rumored to be the remains of a once great civilization that flourished in the Iliac Bay, with similar legends and stories telling of Dreg kingdoms of coral around and in modern day Morrowind before even the Dwemer arrived to the region. Quite literally, nothing remains for us to speculate on with this potential ancient society, other than some short mentions in canon lore and some expansions of the concepts in later obscure texts. That having been said, this apparently partially underwater, partially above water society of Dreg, ruled by Dreg kings, which ruled part of northern Tamriel, is an extremely cool concept nonetheless, and they're even expanded in some mythical sources, like for example Mankar Cameron's commentaries on the Mysterium Xarxes, where he mentions Dreg kings ruling the mythical and strange continent of Lig, which we don't even know whether or not it existed. See, what we're working with, we're not really sure on whether or not this realm ever really existed, but it's a cool concept and definitely worth a mention in a video like this. Now, those are the larger scale societies which existed on Tamriel before the elves' arrival, but there were several other smaller societies that we know about existing on Tamriel at this time. First off, the infamous Birdmen of Cyrodiil, a race of intelligent humanoid birds, think the Rito from The Legend of Zelda, who apparently lived on and around the Imperial city Isle. Their society seems to have been ended because of enslavement by the ancient Khajiit, or the later Alien elves who were also in the business of enslaving the local population, or perhaps a combination of both. Now, there were also some tribal clans of proto-humans. Now, there's a whole can of worms about where these proto-humans came from, and I explained that whole shtick in my video on Atmora and my position on it. But on ancient Tamriel, there seem to have been two distinct groups of humans. First were small tribal realms in the lighter jungles and swamps of modern-day Blackmarsh. These humans were weird, and all became extinct in the first and second eras due to plagues. These humans had strange features such as the silver-skinned Kothringi humans and the eyeless Orma humans, and the Horwali and Yespet humans as well, who we don't really have any lore on. And then there were the more conventional small clans of humans in the northern half of Tamriel, primarily Skyrim, High Rock, Cyrodiil and Hammerfell, who most likely came from Atmora before the big migrations which would become the Proto-Nordic society. You see, for thousands of years, before the Atmoran rulers and dragon worshippers would try to colonize Tamriel with places like Sarthal and many of the Nordic ruins that we see in Skyrim, the ancient humans of Atmora had allegedly been sending prisoners and other smaller groups of humans on exile to Tamriel, with apparently also noble second sons without much hope for riches on Atmora also making the trip with their retinue. These groups seem to have come before the elves already, although some speculate that these groups didn't come from Atmora at all and they were actually native to Tamriel, and the whole Atmora story is propaganda. Pick your poison in that. I personally explain my position more clearly in the Atmora video, and I think that the humans that are more like conventional humans, so the Needs basically, who would evolve into the playable races of humans, except for the Redguards obviously, that they came from Atmora, and that these weird humans of southern Tamriel, so for example the Orma and the Kothringi, that those were native to Tamriel. But hey, pick your poison. What is important is that these small clans and tribes of humans who apparently already were there did not really do anything of note and didn't form any civilizations, at least as far as we know of from the records, until at least several centuries to even a millennia into the formation of the Elven empires. But some humans were apparently already living on Tamriel. Now, in the wild and untamed jungles of modern-day Valenwood, there really seemingly wasn't much save for the tribal ape men, the Imga, who had their own clans and tribes in the jungles. The same actually goes for parts of southern Blackmarsh, where you had the Lilmothid, the foxmen of Blackmarsh, who also lived a tribal lifestyle and we know very little about. And also for High Rock, because while the coastlines were apparently dominated by the Dreg, more inland you primarily seem to have clans of other beast folk living a very impermanent life like the Centaurs. It's also a very similar situation for the Somerset Isles, where the land is said to have been wild and filled with monsters and other dangerous creatures, with amidst it all apparently some small-scale goblin civilizations, with some speculating that the goblins may have had actual kingdoms on the Somerset Isles rather than just some clans and small towns. They were there actually when the first elves arrived and formed trading relations with them before the elves would eventually enslave them, after which they were driven not to extinction but driven to the designation of a lower being. Meanwhile, there are suggestions that even in later eras, goblins are significantly more intelligent than simple monsters, as even in the 4th and 3rd eras they live in defined clans, have religions, have language, have mastered magic and even animal domestication, which is extremely interesting and kinda tragic, as none of the intelligent races necessarily treat them with the respect that they probably do. And while it's possible that they had kingdoms on the Somerset Isles, we also know that they might have lived in other places like I mentioned earlier in the video, meaning that goblin civilization definitely had a bit of a downfall since prehistoric times. Now, it's also suggested that there was another civilization on the Somerset Isles, one that may have enslaved the goblins before even the elves arrived. And those are the Slode, who in later eras live west of Tamriel. They, in modern day Tamriel, built underwater cities out of coral, making their home continent of Thras earn the name of the Coral Kingdom. And we have sources claiming that under some cities in the Somerset Isles, primarily Cloudrest, one can still find prehistoric coral ruins below the ancient elven ruins, indicating that the Slode, or another coral building civilization, may have once thrived on the Somerset Isles before the elves even landed there. Now, there are other creatures which apparently had primitive civilizations at this time, mostly tribal civilizations. such as the earlier mentioned fox beast race, the Lilmuthid, who lived in southern Blackmarsh, and also the goat beast race fawns, somewhere on the mainland, and apparently even emperor crabs, who seem to have some intelligence, but they couldn't really be called civilizations. Now, as far as we know, those were the primary civilizations and others who were present on ancient Tamriel. And now, having talked about the races that lived on this ancient prehistoric Tamriel, let's now talk about the animals and other creatures that were on this ancient Tamriel. While much of modern day Nirn's fauna, like for example deer, frostbite spiders, dune ripper, saber-toothed tigers and much more already existed, it's primarily the creatures which are now extinct and which are radically different to what we find on modern day Tamriel that give us an insight into the kinds of creatures that lived in this ancient world. So I want to give the mic again to past me, as we will talk about some of the interesting and crazy creatures that we can find in ancient Tamriel, which are now long since extinct. So, extinct creatures. There are quite a few of them in Tamriel's lore, and we will start with one of the most interesting of the bunch, the Verminous, a creature very much like a dinosaur, which was said to roam the province of Morrowind in ancient times. The creatures seem vaguely familiar to our world's Velociraptor dinosaur, or the Troodondid or Dromaeosaur dinosaurs, as Mr. Tarpenpat, who helped me a lot with this video, suggested. Except that these creatures have several spikes and horns and long claws for hands, although it may also be similar to another dinosaur which neither I or Mr. Tarpenpat are aware of, as I am at least unfortunately not a specialist on the topic of dinosaurs. Sorry. Anyway, the Tamrielic creature, the Verminous, seems to have roamed around Morrowind since prehistoric times and died out and has gone extinct somewhere in the early First Era, as Sothasil of the Tribunal, one of Morrowind's living gods, still remembers them from that time. It is in fact through his works in the Clockwork City, Sothasil's own mechanical city, that we are even aware of the Verminous nowadays, as Sothasil has recreated a mechanical version of the Verminous, a fabricant, to populate the wilds around his artificial city, just like Morrowind had once been. In his words, he did this to try and preserve the past as a reminder of how things once were, although we don't know much about how much he changed on these creatures that he recreated. But since Sothasil's stated aim was to recreate the past and accurately preserve it, I think the Verminous would have been similar to the fabricated Verminous, but just without the mechanical parts. That having been said, we possibly have another example of Sothasil recreating an extinct species, although for this one we don't really have any concrete lore other than seeing what they look like in-game and in official art. You see, we also have this creature, the so-called hulking fabricant, which also looks vaguely like a dinosaur-like creature, and it was also created by Sothasil. So if we do some mental gymnastics, knowing that Sothasil tried to preserve the distant past, and that's why he brought the Verminous back, it's not unlikely that this may also have been an actual organic creature at some time, probably called the hulking. So that makes two Tamrielic dinosaurs which roamed Morrowind in ancient times, which is pretty cool. And there may be even more, but we're not completely sure about that. But we do have several other examples of now extinct prehistoric Tamrielic creatures. For example, ammonites, small mollusks with a spiral-shaped shell, at least in the real world. We know that in the oceans around Tamriel, specifically the Eltharic Ocean west of Tamriel, there once lived ammonites in a period which is described to have been earlier than the building of the very first Meretic era ruins that we find on Tamriel, meaning that perhaps they may even date back to the Dawn era, the era of creation. Which makes these creatures super duper interesting, because adding to this is that the ammonite shell's fossils found in specifically the Eltharic Ocean contain a lot of raw magicka, which makes the fossils glow bluish. Sometimes they contain almost as much energy or magicka as a lesser soul gem, although there's no way to load magicka into them after they've been depleted, and they lose their magical charge quite quickly after being harvested from the oceans and mined on the islands in the oceans. Some people on Tamriel speculate that this magicka infusion of these fossils is because the fossils are affected by slowed magic from Thras. But it's also possible, especially since the lorebook mentions raw magicka, that these fossils are a leftover from creatures that existed when the world was being created, so they were exposed to the raw magicka of a mortal plane under construction, a bit like radiation, which is now why their fossils, so these ammonite fossils, are imbued with raw magicka. But that's just my personal speculation, which I would think is cool. The slowed magicka option is also very much still an option. That being said, in this fossil collection from the Elder Scrolls Battlespire that you've seen on screen so far, we can see not only just ammonites, but we can also see trilobites, which were ancient arthropods living in the seas in our own universe in prehistoric times. But unfortunately, other than this image, we have nothing else on trilobites on Tamriel in the Elder Scrolls universe, so sorry, but hey, they're in an official image, so they may have existed. That having been said, another creature that we don't have much on is the so-called lava troll, a troll once said to have been native to Morrowind, specifically to Vvardenfell. Although some even doubt whether or not lava trolls were ever even real or not. That will be a trend in this video, as you'll see. Because this is so far all that we know of it, and people on Tamriel actually doubt whether they existed at some point. Like, we don't even know why it was called the lava troll, perhaps because it was able to live close to lava? I don't know. We just don't know. Now, an extinct creature that we know a bit more of is the so-called Raksu, a bird which had lived in Blackmarsh since before the elves came to Tamriel, where it had some connection to Sithis worship in the society of the ancient Argonians, specifically with worship connected to reincarnation and life cycles, it seems. They were apparently really big, as tall as a mammoth, with huge tongues, and they were distantly related to the terror birds of elsewhere. They were actually only driven extinct near the tail end of the First Era in the year 2828, a year when several other species in Blackmarsh also went extinct. Because you see, during this year the Reman Empire attempted to conquer Blackmarsh and accidentally set fire to much of the province when they set fire to a bog near Stormhold. But they didn't realize that much of the bogs are connected both over and underground, making it so that large swaths of Blackmarsh straight up burned down in an event called the Great Burn. During this event, much of Blackmarsh's creatures either had a big dip in their population or were outright driven extinct, with the Raksu being one of the creatures driven to extinction by the event. But this loss of biodiversity was not limited to just the Raksu, as we both lost the so-called long-legged swamp wolves and the Hellstrom crocodiles, and presumably even more creatures than just those, except those didn't make it into the lore. Now, neither of these we know particularly much of, other than that, just like the Raksu, they were presumably big creatures, as at least the Hellstrom crocodile is said to have been a really large type of crocodile, and the long-legged swamp wolves, well, they have long legs, so they may be big, but, well, we don't really know much else about them, other than that they entered into a steep population decline during and after the Great Burn, with the last sighting of one of these taking place in the very early Second Era. Now, there are some other creatures where we know that they are extinct, but other than that, we don't know much more of them. Examples of these include flightless desert hawks, which I presume would have been much like ostriches, but then hawks. Yeah, roaming the desert. We also have prehistoric snow owls, which may have been a variation of regular snow owls, and we also have the so-called musk ox, a type of ox which once apparently lived in western Skyrim, specifically in the Reach, where its horns were presumably used by Reachmen as war horns, which is also literally the only thing we know about them, as a war horn is the only thing that we have of them, but even the description of that warhorn speculates that it may have been a minotaur, so we don't even know whether these oxes existed, but hey, it's worth a mention. Now, a creature that we know similarly little about is the so-called Nchorabal, a rock-skinned bug which in ancient times was native to Vvardenfell and Red Mountain, which were all driven extinct by the Dunmer, with the last one reportedly being slain by Vivek himself using his legendary spear, with a statue in Vivek City actually commemorating the event. We also don't know much more about the Nchorabal, sorry, as I already mentioned in my video on all the bugs of Tamriel. Check that video out, by the way. It's a pretty good video. It's in the description. Alright, but let's return to a creature that we know a bit more of, the so-called garnet bird. A tropical bird that was once native to the Topol Bay to the south of Cyrodiil, and apparently they had a beak with the color of a red garnet, and back in the late First Era, they became a favorite of noble dining tables, often served at great feasts after being drowned in wine. This became such a popular dish that the garnet beaks were driven to extinction, quite quickly actually, as they were hunted down for noble dining tables. Good job, guys. Now, we have one more bird type that's now extinct that we know of, the so-called gooblet bird, a large flightless bird with colorful feathers native to Hammerfell, which were driven extinct sometime after the arrival of the Yokudans on Tamriel. How they were driven extinct? We don't know. Could be anything. Could be the Yokudans, could not have been. I don't know. That having been said, we also know of the gigantic prehistoric emperor crabs. Gigantic crabs that once roamed the ashlands of Vardenfell. These large gigantic crabs were sometimes as big as a cathedral, and apparently they were a sight to behold. And for this one we actually know quite certain that they existed, as their ancient shells are still being used. For example, the gigantic shell of the emperor crab Scar was being used to house the city of Ald'ruhn, as we can see in Morrowind and the Elder Scrolls Online. However, by the Third Era, all of these Emperor crabs had died out. They were being hunted down by both Ashlanders and by House Redoran, with some people saying that those that remained may have devolved into the mud crabs, but we don't know what's true about that. Now, for the final set of extinct creatures, we actually need to delve into some history. So, a little history. In the middle of the Meretic era, the Aldmer, that's the Aldmer with a D, so the progenitor race of all elven races that we find on Tamriel, not the current High Elves, fled their homeland of Aldmuris due to it being endangered by some mysterious impending doom. Now, the first place that they landed were the Somerset Isles, although it wouldn't take long before they also hopped over to Valenwood and tried to colonize it. However, these lands that they landed on, the Somerset Isles and Valenwood, they weren't exactly empty when the first elves arrived. In fact, they were inhabited by a large range of creatures, many of whom were large, dangerous and not very welcoming to these elves that landed on their shores. But the elves didn't really care about that and just decided to kill all of them to make these lands safe. A few of such creatures which they encountered, like griffins, ended up surviving up until the current day and get tamed. But not all ancient creatures that the Altmer encountered were as lucky, as the Altmer drove many of the creatures they encountered to extinction by just killing all of them and preventing their procreation in order to make the Somerset Isles livable for themselves, and they then tried but kinda failed to do the same in Valenwood. When it comes to the Somerset Isles, there are two main legendary and mythical creatures which were driven to extinction. Basically, we've got the Gaetus and the Iliadi. Let's start with the Iliadi, which is a type of forest spirit, or even fairy according to some theories. They were creatures with more than just two eyes, as they were forest giants whose entire heads were covered by eyes. These creatures were apparently also aggressive to the Altmer, being named in ancient Altmeri ballads as working with other creatures to try and achieve the Altmer's demise and drive them from the Isles. Unfortunately for these creatures, they were no match for the early Altmer, however, who brought ancient magic from their homeland of Aldmuris, which was used to exterminate them in just a few short years after their landing. Now, the other mythical enemy of the Altmer that they found when landing on the Isles and who wasn't particularly friendly to them and they exterminated was the Gaetus. Now, how exactly these Gaetus lost to the ancient Altmeri magic is not very clear to me. Because according to legend, the Gaetus were straight up godlike fairies with, according to legends, godlike powers. And because of that, I personally kinda doubt whether or not they even existed in the way that they are described, or were just adapted into Altmeri legend in a more grand way to make their victory over these creatures seem more epic. But yeah, we don't really know. What we do know is that on ancient Altmer tapestries, the Gaetus are described as a type of godlike fairy which takes the shape of a single man or multiple men which are created from the earth itself. This man or group of men is then surrounded by minor fairies which all do its bidding. Considering that these creatures are extinct, I wouldn't be surprised if the Gaetus was just one of the Earthmen and the rest were minor spirits. But we don't really know anything about them, unfortunately, and even that's all conjecture. Anyhow, those two, the Iliadi and the Gaetus, were driven to extinction on the Somerset Isles by the early Altmer in their quest to make the Isles theirs. But there's actually another creature that was driven to extinction on the Somerset Isles, and that one was called the so-called Isgareth bee. This type of bee used to be quite common on the Somerset Isles since ancient times, but due to the belief of some Altmer that their honey granted immortality, which was really just legend and seemingly not true, it seems that their hives were all destroyed by greedy Altmer somewhere in the First Era. All of them then went extinct. Although some conspiracy theorists on Tamriel believe that some royalty still have them in private gardens, but we don't have any proof on that. Now, just like on the Somerset Isles, the Altmer immediately started blasting when they arrived to Valenwood, while the jungles proved to be harder to exterminate species in than the Isles. As many of their ancient predators still live in the jungles nowadays, they did manage to get rid of a few creatures. Most notably the Basilisk, a creature that we see in many types of fantasy, but which also exists in the Elder Scrolls lore, but it's just extinct due to the doing of the elves. And the portrayal of basilisks, from what we know, is pretty conventional, because it's a snake with magical powers and whose body parts have magical properties. And likely, just like in other types of fantasy, looking them in the eyes would have caused for paralysis, but that's just speculation, as their eyes, cooked up in a potion, can be used to cure paralysis. So I'd say that it's likely that looking them in the eye would have had the inverse effect and probably paralyzed you, especially since that's the whole thing with basilisks and other types of media. That said, their body parts, while rare, are still sometimes seen on the black market in private collections of alchemists and other craftsmen, because their eyes are a potent ingredient and their blood can temper weapons, and powdered body parts can even give you a poisonous explosion, which is all pretty useful. That said, of the creatures which they drew to extinction in Valenwood, we know relatively little other than the basilisks. For example, of the creature, the Odawak, we know literally nothing more than their name, and that they are extinct in Valenwood now, and that they apparently had really big fangs, and that Bosmer legend says that they drove them to extinction, and not the Altmer. We also know that in Valenwood there used to live hippogriffs, who were likely related to the griffins in some way, but they were also driven to extinction. How? We don't know. Hydra also existed, multi-headed dragon-like creatures likely also driven to extinction, although those may still exist in other parts of Nirn. And forest giants, likely related to the Iliadi, also existed and also were apparently driven to extinction. And satyrs were also in existence, which we don't know anything of other than that they were there and we know their names. We don't even know what type of creature they were, only the name from the Pocket Guide to the Empire, and that they were, you may guess, driven to extinction by the early Altmer who had landed in Valenwood. But considering that in other types of fantasy they are essentially fauns, a man-beast who are part goat, part man, I think that's the type of creature that they probably were before being driven to extinction. In the High Alt DLC of the Elder Scrolls Online, we actually see some fauns, so perhaps there's a chance that those were the creatures that they meant by the name satyr, so they may not be extinct, but we don't know if that's actually the case. Now, a final honorable mention for this video goes to Skyrim's snow whales, a creature which is possibly purely mythical, but may also have been real. We just don't really know. You see, snow whales were legendary flying whales which flew through the skies of Skyrim, just like sand whales apparently flew over the deserts of Hammerfell, living at the tops of the highest mountains and shooting through the clouds, with Nord hunters hunting them fiercely. And the Whalebone Bridge in Sovngarde was said to have been constructed from the bones of a snow whale. But these creatures were supposedly only visible after drinking a strange potion, and some of the other out-of-game legends about them describe them as even more fantastical, so it could also just be some hallucination of the Nords which hadn't made its way into Nordic legend. We don't really know. Whatever the truth is, they haven't been seen on Tamriel for a very long time. And that having been said, that was about all that I had on the extinct creatures of Tamriel. Now, this was basically all that over the course of a few years I have been able to find about Prehistoric Tamriel, and I sincerely hope that you enjoyed this video and managed to learn something new about the Elder Scrolls lore today. And if you did, why not give the video a like or one of those hype things, it would really help out the channel. By the way, if you need a new notebook for, lore notes or study notes, I happen to sell Imperial knowledge lore notebooks. Look, I'm doing things like this with it, but you can use it for normal notes or something else. Okay, mandatory March plug over. Look in the description or in the top comment for a link to the store. By the way, if you've watched all the way until the end, because this is once again a very long video, why don't you comment what your favorite video game of all time is? It would be hilarious to see people talking about games in the comments which nobody understands why you're plugging your randomly different game. And then I know that you've watched the entire video, and I might get some inspiration, to play something different than Skyrim for the 5,000th hour, because we still don't have Elder Scrolls 6. And now all that's left for me to be done is to thank my top Patreon supporters: Goblark, Bernardo Binda, Gabriel Binda, Volcure of Argonia, RB Dash, Lexicon, Polycom, Sir Otter, Sword of Bushido, Rakai, Mike Willis, Dodo Komodo, James Lynch, Barademas, and Kalakranz. These people, along with all the amazing people on screen, are my Patreon supporters and my YouTube members, and they keep this channel alive. And for that, I am very grateful. Alright, see you in the next lore video. Bye bye.